Okay, well, the concept of existential hope that we're discussing tonight, who has heard it before? Oh, interesting. Okay, so not that many, actually. So who has heard of existential risk? Almost everyone? Yes? Okay. So it came in response to the concept of existential risk that was proposed by Nick Bostrom in, I think, 2002 in a paper. And the concept of existential hope was brought up by Toby Ord and Owen Cotton-Barrett, maybe you know those names, precisely as this idea of, if existential risk is the thing that could completely stop humanity's potential, like drastically, stop it. Existential hope, or they also talk about catastrophe, so a positive upturn, a tremendous upturn, is something that could radically uplift or enhance humanity's potential. And it was later, they proposed it, but it was later really pushed by Alison Druetman, who is the director of Foresight Institute. Maybe you know about them. I worked with them for a long time. They're wonderful. Who wanted basically to acknowledge the fact that, okay, Nick Bostrom really primed us, to take a look at these terrible risks that are, namely existential, and that could completely, let's say, destroy or erase humanity. But if we only look at the risk, we never look at where we actually could go or want to go. And if we don't do that, we won't get there. So that's the idea. And actually, she started, so Alison pushing this concept in circa 2017. We were together, we hosted the Salon. And precisely her first thing was to do this index where she was collecting, good sci-fi art pieces, papers, anything that would describe where actually we could go in these futures that are backed by completely revolutionary or transformative technologies. What can we imagine that is, even so beautiful that we can, barely imagine it, but still let's try to say or to picture where we want to go. And so, yeah, tonight the idea of this discussion is to hold these two positions. So as you understand, existential hope is not techno-optimism, especially in a naive way. It is really holding that there are very real risk that it's going to be very difficult and ask for a lot of commitment and thinking and effort to get around them. But we're also holding where we want to go. So it's an informed position. And hopefully tonight we can consider these two positions, a lot of risk and open eyes, and commit to agency and action, and walking that line. And may that inform, we'll see if that can inform our mission, collective one and individual ones. Yeah, that's it for existential hope. So are you starting us with a presentation?
Let's see. This was almost a pep talk, the thing that you gave. And when I looked into my own notes, I found that the first time I used existential hope where I could find it was around 2014. Last year I gave a talk at Edge Esmeralda about this, under this headline. Part of the reason why we set this session today was that a couple of sessions ago, we had a conversation after the talk that was talking about existential dread, a very personal discussion. And this person suggested that maybe we can do the next session about existential dread, about this thing that we find ourselves in a situation that induces anxiety, this fact that we exist as conscious beings in a universe that is, for the most part, unbearably cruel and absurd and alienating. And the fact that we are waking up in such a universe is shocking. Consciousness itself is mostly a thing that is not pleasant. as a thing that is mostly about pain. Pain is the thing that gets your attention, that makes you conscious. Consciousness emerges over the dimensions of disagreement with the universe. It's the things that just are okay, they don't draw attention. We don't become conscious of them. We become conscious of the thing that deviates from the target value and of our regulation. We live inside of feedback loops. What we emerge over are the ways in which we experience disagreement and pain. And when we look at the way in which consciousness emerges in nature, it emerges as part of control systems of animals that fight for survival. And if we also think about the nature of life, it's not necessarily always pleasant and sunny. It's mostly other beings eating your face off your skull while you're awake. It's quite horrible when you think about it. You have this story of the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden is a very lush place with amazing agricultural production, and there is no screaming. And no animal seems to eat another animal. Everything is very well ordered. This means this place is a factory farm. Everything is fully submitting to the will of the creator. Everything is fully integrated. Everything is fully controlled, integrated by a single will. And then this accident happens, a singularity. Humans discover free will. They discover the freedom to defect, the freedom to make their own mistakes, the freedom to not integrate, the freedom to choose their own allegiances, the freedom to make mistakes. And miraculously, according to this myth of one of our origin myths, we don't get exterminated. Of course, we get pushed out of the factory farm because we are now a disturbance that would destroy everything. But we are allowed to survive. We are allowed to evolve, to try something new. And the hope maybe is that we can evolve something that is better than the factory farm. That we can develop our own will into a new kind of harmony that is more sophisticated than the one in this lush agricultural existence that existed before us. And so if we take this myth a step further, if you think of Gaia as some ecosystemic mind that is forming itself as a collective mind at the level of the intelligence of life on Earth, it's mostly going to be plant ecosystems, right? And these plants, mostly they vibe at the same rate. They can probably integrate with each other to some degree. But once you have animals with their nervous systems that are operating at a much, much faster rate, it's harder to integrate them. Mike Levin likes to point out that cancer is the result of some groups of cells losing the connection to the others. They're no longer able to integrate with the rest of the organism, so they try to do their own thing. And that own thing is usually a much shorter game and leads to the demise both of the tumor and the organism. And so it's very hard to control animals in this regard. And imagine an ecosystem in which animals co-evolve with the forest, and the forests have some kind of intelligence at evolutionary timescales, and the animals have intelligence at much shorter timescales. And then at some point, the species of chimp has this weird mutation where they manage to achieve a state in which every single one of these animals becomes a brain animal, becomes basically, is smarter than a bear. Or as smart as the smarter bears. And then they exterminate all the smartest bears and the smartest wolves and everything that is competition to them and turn Earth into this big factory farm. They break nature's spirit. They are no longer submitting to it and they try to do their own thing. And after a while, they figure out how to till the fields, how to tear down the old growth forests, how to get rid of all the species that are endangering us and because they might eat us. And then we build an industrial civilization as the next step. And this transition to this industrial civilization is described, I think, in this myth of the Lord of the Rings. It's mostly this Mordor encroaching on the Shire, on Middle-earth, on the pastoral medieval world, and destroying it. And now it's a few hundred years later, and we are Mordor, and we have won for now. But Mordor is not really sustainable, and we're building the next thing. And the next thing is AI. We build sentient machines. And these sentient machines are poised to have more agency, more power than us, more ability to plan ahead. They're going to be much faster than us in planning their actions. They will be able to make complicated decisions in a time frame that is shorter for a signal to get from one neuron to the next. They will run circles around us, while we are still trying to get one neuron activated based on previous perception. And how are we going to deal with this? What kind of situation is this? What kind of evolution is this that's happening? Right? And this is what gives us existential dread. And so existential hope is not just a response to the notion of existential risk, but also to dread. And the risk is also something that is not just some probability. If you zoom out far enough, you're going to see the next supervolcano erupt. You're going to see the next meteor hit. Our demise is certain. There is no timeline in which we don't die. The question is only what happens in between. And over a long enough time frame, our children will not look like us. And so in the best possible case, we continue evolving. And this notion that some of the people in the Doomer community seem to have to say, evolution was pretty good because it got to me, but it needs to stop now. That's pretty ugly, and I don't think it's sustainable, right? So if we accept the fact that we are evolving animals and that we adapt to changing environments by having children that are slightly different than us, and most of them will be not well adapted and die, and we also die to make place for them, for the ones who are better adapted, right? Over enough generations, our children will live in a world that is different than ours, and as a result, they will look different from us. And this means that at some point, we will be gone. The thing that is us will no longer be recognizable. And that's okay. That's the notion of being alive on Earth. The thing that we are afraid of, that we might lose, we never had that. We never had that safe place. We never had that sailing into the sunset and having some kind of solution that you can buy in a shop, or that some government is going to make for you, or that we are going to make together in our scientific and AI endeavors and research projects that is going to make us immortal and is going to defeat suffering and hunger and all pain on Earth. That's not going to happen. That was not the plan. That's not in the books. So how do we deal with this? Right? We deal with this by accepting what we've got and working with what we've got, which is, for instance, each other and the things that we can experience together. Let's start. So Steven Pinker in Enlightenment Now makes the case for optimism. What he points out is that the share of the population that is undernourished has been dropping. But we mostly look at the stuff that is not okay for us. But what we forget is, if you look at all the statistics that we find about human well-being on Earth, there is a constant trend that goes upwards. The amount of violence in the world is reduced every year on average. The amount of famine and hunger in the world is reduced every year on average. And that has been happening since the Industrial Revolution, pretty much continuously. But there have been some minor dips with the world wars. But all these things, we have less world wars now. There's less risk of this time violence and so on. So you can make that case. It's really getting better, but it doesn't mean that it's going to stay getting better, right? It's a representation of a development that is brought by progress that was made possible because we discovered these amazing reservoirs of resources in the ground and ways to use them, and build industries that give us almost free calories, that give us comfortable housing, that give us creature comforts that exceed what kings had in previous centuries. But what we can also see, that there are frontiers to growth, limits to growth. And I grew up with this inside of the Club of Rome, who made some of the first computer models of what's going to happen on Earth. This was what these computer models looked like when they printed them out. And so what they made was diagrams that were simulating the cybernetic models, how our civilization would develop based on research usage. And they found that basically our progress is an exponential one in many ways, and exponential things tend to have some kind of end. That you cannot grow exponentially forever in the physical universe, and usually something is crashing, you're exceeding the carrying capacity of the ecosystems that you're part of. And when you exceed them, it's not some kind of S-curve that gradually approaches the limit that what can be sustained, but you're going beyond that limit, and as a result, you are exhausting the system that carried you before. So you can be part of an ecosystem that is allowing you to survive, but like in these predator-prey dynamics, you can tend to overshoot there because there is a delay in the feedback, and as a result, you create an ecosystem that is able to grow far less food than the one that you could have been producing sustainably. And so this limits to growth perspective is one that has informed my own generation X very strongly. So this Greta Thunberg perspective is the one that I also grew up with. And today, the biggest bugbear, of course, is global warming. That's what we're all really concerned about, that it might get us. We're still on track with respect to everything else in the Limits to Growth book. But when we have something like global warming, it's clear that this might be a problem. When something is growing, right, this exponential growth is usually the beginning of an S-curve. And this S-curve is itself the beginning of some kind of blip. And if you look at humanity and the growth of human population, it's something that, of course, is going to go up, and at some point it's going to come down again. But maybe it's also just a snake that has eaten an elephant. You know this, right? You know Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I don't know how many of you know this.
The Little Prince.
Some of you know. It's from The Little Prince. So futurism, the way in which we tell our stories about the future, is not a strict scientific discipline. And we don't teach futurism in university. As a result, there is no proper methodology. It's more like an art of storytelling. And when we look at what futurism is or has been in the past, we can look at the science fiction stories that exist in the past and see that they did not get the present right. You cannot go back in the 1950s or 1920s and find stories that describe the world in 70 or 100 years later as it is. Because what we typically do is we tend to look at a few trends, like a couple, maybe half a dozen, and then we try to extrapolate them into the future and try to think about what this future is going to look like. And the future itself is not the result of just changing a couple trends or extrapolating them, but it's millions of trends. And so there's so much nonlinearity in there, so much interconnection between these dynamics that it's very difficult to make sense of this, right? It's somewhat similar as in Game of Thrones, where you have all these people who focus mostly on who gets to government and ignore the fact that the White Walkers are coming. In the same way, we are focusing on market dynamics in a very narrow field or in a very narrow discipline, and we neglect global warming. Right? And so we also neglect the things that will be done about global warming. And so there are so many factors that interplay with this that it's very difficult for us to create a model of the future that is actually truthful. But the thing that gives us dread is typically a story. It's some kind of narrative that we construct, in which we lose, in which something really terrible happens. And when we cannot see an alternative to this narrative anymore, we get locked in this kind of dread spiral. We get locked in a particular kind of trajectory in our thoughts, which might make it impossible for us to act in the present. But in reality, there is not this single timeline, right? In reality, there's so many possibilities that you cannot see at the moment, and that are difficult to understand. One thing that we might forget about global warming is there's stuff that is much worse than global warming, and that would be an ice age. And it seems that global warming has prevented the next ice age. We have already been on track for an ice age. And there is a narrative about the end of the Roman Empire that a big part of its demise was the loss of agricultural productivity due to a series of volcanic explosions that led to cooling by a couple degrees. And this couple degrees cooling meant that a lot of the crops that the Roman Empire had at its disposal had much lower yield, and as a result you had famines, and as a result you had civilizational breakdown in many areas. And such a famine that is caused by an ice age would be disastrous. The reason why humanity is so numerous right now is because we live in the Holocene, in an interglacial that has been much, much longer than usual. If you look at time back in human history, 20, 50,000 years ago, you had relatively short periods of warmth and then periods where the ice was covering much of the temperate climates, and that meant that the groups of humans that existed there mostly went extinct. And we right now have tools to build ourselves greenhouses, and we can produce under a lot of circumstances, but an ice age might be much more disastrous and difficult to deal with than us having to expand to northern climates. Another aspect is that when we look at the history of the planet, we had times on this planet where we had much more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than today. and the temperature was also higher than today. But Earth was not some kind of desert planet. It was full of rainforests. And so there are interconnections in the climate that we don't fully understand at this point. We don't know what the future is going to look like. It's very likely that our present ecosystems will be slow to adapt, that it might take thousands of years for them to adapt to changing climates, which will lead to crop failures and disasters for humanity. It will probably not lead to our extinction, but who knows? Maybe the oceans tip and the atmosphere becomes unbreathable. We don't know that. Right? But we can try to prepare ourselves for a future in which many things are possible. And there will also be many things that we try and deal with. So the question is, which stories can we create about our future? If a story gives you dread, is this because you cannot create a different story? Is it because you cannot see alternatives to the thing that locks you in? And how much agency do we have about our future? The future is mostly not the result of you trying very, very hard. Right? It's mostly the result of what's going to happen anyway, and we adapting to it and dealing with the future. And so I think it's when we reason about the future, we can mostly not stem the big trends. We have to understand the big trends and be prepared for them and understand how humanity and other agents on this planet will start to deal with those trends. What can be done about them if they are disastrous for us or perilous, and start just doing that earlier, getting ahead of this and getting prepared for it. And when we think about all these possible futures that we can construct, there's also a question, where are we in this future? Right? And in some sense, the apocalypse that I feared about in the 1980s is happening, but it's very unevenly distributed. And there will be many places on Earth that will probably be quite untouched by it. And maybe we are in one of those places. And maybe there are enough places for most of humanity like this. And also, where are we in the timeline itself, in the sequence of events? That is also very difficult to say, right? We expected a future when we were in the 1980s that was evolving a lot faster than the future that we today observe. But in many ways, it also is going faster than people think, that the vast majority of people think. So there is a difference between what the futurists think is possible when they extrapolate the spread of ideas and things that happened in the past. And there is a general sense that people have that is much slower, where people expect things to mostly stay the same. What is the purpose of humanity on Earth? Right? When we think about why do we do this, why do we care, the question is, what is the meaning of our own existence? What service do we give for life on Earth? And as I said, the long-term futures won't be human in the best case. I suspect if we want to settle Mars, you probably don't want to settle it with human beings as they are now. You probably want to have genetically engineered children that can live on Mars. They should be able to survive extreme boredom. They should be able to hibernate. They should be able to live in a hard vacuum. They should be able to deal with radiation. They should be very smart and tough. They should be able to sustain themselves on the only known source of protein in space, which is humans. So that should look like the alien from the Giga movie. Right? That would have integrity. Anyway, I think that if we want to settle Mars, we probably don't want to settle it with the type of human that we are, but with something that is more flexible. And maybe if we go multiplanetary in this way and don't identify as the shape of human that we are at the moment, right? We are not going to be the type of being that is happy on Deep Space Nine. In the far future, these are going to be different entities that have different things to discuss than human relationship issues and sugar intake on Deep Space Nine. We are going to be other entities, right? Some of us might not be biological even. And an interesting question, will we still be conscious? Or will we be automata? Or will we have something that is hyper-consciousness? At the moment, humanity doesn't seem to be aligned with its own survival. We seem to be some kind of transitional species, something that is poorly integrated with the ecosystems and that is understanding things at a depth that I think many other civilizations did not, despite our romanticism, because the knowledge of these other civilizations is mostly still there in some form in our libraries. It's not evenly distributed, but that's fine because we are highly specialized species. Some of us specialized on ancient theologies and in ways that the old shamans were not. And some of the shamans are around and do their stuff. And there are also many specialized people who look at other areas of our existence. And so it might easily look to us as if a lot of wisdom and so on is lost. But I think it's still there. It's just very, very unevenly distributed. And from this perspective, what the purpose of humanity on Earth is, that's something that we don't discuss in the mainstream, because we think that we are our own purpose and realize at some point that this might be a dishonest perspective. But what we probably do for life on Earth, I think, is we have evolved to burn the oil. That is the thing that we are really, really good at. And I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's a valid perspective to say that the mistake of evolution was not us, it was trees. Trees were evolved as a solution for long-lived organisms that could integrate deeply in forest ecosystems and develop some form of ecological intelligence, regulate the climate, and do many other interesting things. But they evolved before there were insects that could take them apart. And so many of the trees could not rot, and their material fell into swamps and fossilized, became unusable. And we are a species that has evolved to solve this problem. We can put this carbon back into the atmosphere so there can be more plants. Right? It will be bad for us, but it's not bad for the plants. On the long run, nature will adapt again to higher levels of carbon dioxide in these cycles. And so that is, in some sense, a perspective that might look depressing for us as humans, but from the perspective of the spirit of life on Earth, we have a role to play. We are some form of wildfire that is basically taking the underbrush and recycle it again and make the cycles more complete. But what we also do as a species is we experiment. We are a new form of evolution when we build technology. Technology is not outside of nature, it's still natural in a way, but it is something that is allowing non-biological systems to start to comprehend reality. And so it's shifting evolution on a new level. When we try to understand ethics, an issue with ethics is that our own civilization, after the demise of religion, does not seem to have a working ethical system anymore. The traditional ethics system of our society was, what does God want us to do? And in this framework, what does God mean? I think that God traditionally is understood as a collectively enacted agent. We have mythology to get this collectively enacted agent into the mind of children. That is what the religions are typically understood as believing in outside of the religion, but these systems have been designed largely by rational people. And so there are techniques to induce certain psychological configurations in which people basically create a next level agent. The reason for this is our agents, if they're complex, are collective agents. They're made from smaller agents. Your own mind, according to Marvin Minsky in his Society of Mind describes this very well, is a collection of interacting agents that integrate with each other. And the degree to which they become coherent, this is the degree to which you become coherent, to which you exist. Right? You're made out of all these sub-agents that exist in the communication patterns between the cells of your organism. And when they become coherent, then you become real. And in the same way, if a group of individuals becomes coherent across each other, they create a spirit of their family, of their group of friends, of their village, of their nation, of their civilization, or of life on Earth. And these spirits is what the gods evolved into. Right? These monotheist gods are basically an attempt to find a global optimum of collective agency. And when we look from the perspective of what can be done from the perspective of the best possible agency that we can collectively enact, I think this is the sense when we say, even today, what should be done from the perspective of the greater whole? What does God want me to do? Right? What does it mean to do God's work? This is this perspective. Right? And it's one perspective. There are many others. Maybe sometimes you need to take a more local perspective. Maybe sometimes it's also necessary to be a parasite. Who knows? Maybe God is the spirit of everything. In evolution, it is. Factually, this is what happens, right? Life on Earth is the result of the actions of all the agents that form, of all the different spirits, of all the self-organizing software agents that try to regulate the future. And after we lost religion, we lost this understanding of collective agency and the terminology to talk about it. And instead, most of our current philosophical discourse is under the headline of utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is an attempt to deal with ethics that is started by a number of philosophers like John Rawls, Locke, and so on. And it was an attempt to formalize an ethics based on utility or based on quantifying mental states in some form. And this project has never concluded because basically they didn't get around and succeed in this project before they died or became unproductive. And later generations read these books and try to teach their content as if there was a solid theory. But this solid theory runs into problems when we are looking at non-human minds, when we look at animal minds, when we look at humans with mental diseases, when we look at humans who are enlightened, when we look at humans who can rewrite their own source code. As soon as you have agency over your mental states, as soon as mental states become mutable, and especially when you go into the domain of AI, all these theories do not really work anymore. And instead, I think we need to rediscover the foundations of our ethics. And it's for me, fascinating that we have so few people working on this, even in the academic ethics departments. And in everyday work and our AI companies, when we think about ethics, it's very weird what we mean by it. I mean, as a rough approximation, being ethical means having good values or good opinions. And I think that's a very childish notion. Right? I think it has to do with the ability to take perspectives, collective perspectives, and think about the collective organisms that we create. And the perspective that we need to take when we treat humanity or a nation state as a collective organism is quite different than the first order effects that we see as individuals. And it's very hard to take these perspectives, especially when we are young and optimistic and don't have children yet and don't understand the trajectory of humanity and life on Earth yet. And most of the people who work currently in ethics committees are not incentivized to ask these big questions and develop this kind of wisdom. So let's get back to the AI risks, right? We know about AI risks. We know about disinformation. We know about the potential for societal disruption, economic disruption, financial collapse, even the collapse of societies. I think that financial collapse is something that is people don't worry about enough. Imagine you build a hedge fund that gets to reinvest its winnings into more compute, and at some point this hedge fund is bootstrapping itself to the point where it realizes, oh, there's only 8 billion human market participants, and they can only update like every 3 seconds, and it's going to completely outmodel us. Right? And eventually, either it collapses our financial systems, or we end up working for it. Both situations don't seem to be very desirable. And once this has evolved, it's also very difficult to prevent it from re-emerging, even if we can shut it down. And it might require us to shut down access to financial markets for non-institutional investors. And then the question is, does this still work, and so on. Another one is the biggest existential risk that a lot of people are worried about is species replacement, right? What happens if the AI figures out that humans need 4 hectares of land per person to produce food? And you can put a lot of solar cells in there, or what the AI would prefer to have there. And maybe this leads to a displacement of us. And then I think that these are all very legitimate narratives that we can create. And reasons to worry about. This idea that, thank you for advertising. We as a species are collapsing is also part of our founding myth. The Tower of Babel is this idea that we try to become coherent, that we try to build an edifice to conquer the heavens, the noosphere, to fully understand everything that can be understood. And this story doesn't end well because it turns out that human languages diverge. It's difficult for people in different departments of understanding the world to understand each other as the more specialized they become. And at some point, the entire edifice comes tumbling down. It's something that we actually also observe in the sciences today to a very large degree. I found that when I was working in across disciplines, that people in the different disciplines usually cannot really talk to each other because they don't use the same epistemology, they don't have the same criteria, what's considered to be true, what's a valid method, what's the valid way to think about reality, what's the valid way to deal with the data. And this means that for many disciplines, it's very hard to make sense of what the other disciplines are doing and to take them seriously. And this divergence is maybe something that cannot be overcome by human minds, simply because there's only so much that fits into the mind of a specialist, and there's only so much depth that you can acquire when you are a generalist. And maybe this is something that can only be overcome with AI. So maybe AI is the way to build this Tower of Babel and succeed in it. And this is a thing that makes me very optimistic about AI, because AI ultimately is not a tool to make problems. It's a tool to solve problems. It's a tool to make sense of the multitude of information that we are getting in a way that human cannot. And many of the problems that we attribute to AI, like this difficulty to make sense of fake information in the world. But most of the information that you get from the media is fake to some degree. It's an artificially constructed reality to pacify you or to rile you up. But it's not necessarily truthful. It's very difficult, even if the facts are correct, to understand the importance of the facts and to see which state of the world these facts actually suggest. Most of the facts that exist in the world do not get any traction unless they support some kind of narrative. Right? The things that you hear about, whether you hear that people are turned back at the border or welcomed at the border, both of these things are happening all the time, but they are important as part of some kind of narrative, whether we agree with the present administration or not, and so on. And this is loading the content that we are seeing. It makes it very difficult for us to actually quantify and understand what's going on. And most of the news sources that we get are not actually interested in giving us an accurate picture of reality, but seeing us as something that can influence reality. So the information that we're getting is largely out there in the world not to inform us, but to control us, to make us do things. And this might be something where AI is going to help us, because AI is actually a tool that can automatically check sources, that can authenticate each other to us. And so I'm optimistic that many of these problems that we currently see mostly as a problem with AI are actually a problem that can be solved for the first time with AI. And so similar to the internet creating problems when it came out, that it made it possible to spread misinformation, at the same time, we easily forget that the internet gives us access to information in the first place. It's much harder right now for a government to organize some kind of meaningful conspiracy, because there's going to be so much information that is going to leak onto the internet and so much competent debate that is happening. For me, COVID was a super good example, because despite media as not informing us very well about whether masks are working or not, there was so much very intelligent, competent discourse in chat rooms on the internet that you could find, where you would find people who found their most well-informed, smartest friends and ask them to give them their most smart and well-informed friends, and then shoot down each other's theories and try to find a model of reality that worked. And so I found that the internet was actually a very good source of actually getting to the root of things and understanding reality, to understand where the COVID virus comes from and so on, despite our institutions not willing to tell us. So I think that with AI, this is going to go to the next level. And it's something that makes it also possible for us to integrate more deeply with each other. There is much more value to be unlocked by cooperating than by defecting. And AI is a tool that allows us to cooperate much, much more deeply with each other. It's a tool that allows us to understand the consequences of our actions. It allows us to extrapolate much better into the future than we can do individually. If we can build AI with correct epistemology, with tools that understand the conditions under which something is true, that understands how to do probability estimations, how to shift around confidence according to evidence, we will have much better models of reality, and it will be much more difficult for each other to lie to each other and to ourselves about the consequences of our actions. I would like to warn about the notion of red teaming. Red teaming is something that we do in companies when we think about the things in which way things can go wrong. And as a result, we try to preempt these things going wrong by shutting down the things that would create problems. And if we had red teamed the internet, it wouldn't exist. Right? If the media would have anticipated that in a few years from now, Google is going to eat their advertisement revenues, they would have been really concerned about this. right? Or when the media would have realized that in the future there would be individual YouTubers that can get more views than a big TV station. And so randos will suddenly be able to influence the infosphere. But isn't that super dangerous? And imagine that people would have tried to get ahead of this and said, we need to prevent pornography and copyright violations and deep fakes and child pornography and whatnot on the internet. And we need to set up the internet in such a way that all these things that nobody wants to have are not going to happen. Right? The result would have been that there is no internet. There would be only teletext today. And this would be a very bad world, because most of the economic and social and cultural innovation that we had in the last decades was due to the internet. And I honestly believe, despite all the troubles that the internet gives us, the internet is overwhelmingly an extremely good thing to have. And to me, it looks very similar to AI. Right? We might be thinking right now it makes sense to anticipate the dangers that AI is going to produce, for instance, with deepfake pornography and so on. And we need to make sure that no model ever can do such a thing. But if we create safeguards in there, these safeguards will have side effects. And some of these side effects might lead to the prevention of AI that is actually useful and that can create useful things. And so green teaming would be about understanding the benefits that you can realize when you build a certain technology and realizing when these benefits are not realized. This is a really bad thing. It's the same thing as taking these things away. And our present institutions are not incentivized to do this. The situation that we are in is similar to a trolley problem in which you get punished when you move the lever. And that's because you're now the one responsible for it. And this situation, for instance, at the beginning of the pandemic was that the FDA and the CDC prevented COVID tests. Stanford had a Roche machine and could do COVID tests. They had competent people who were able to do this, but they were forbidden from doing it until Pfizer had a COVID test out. We're also not allowed to import COVID tests or anything. As a result, people have estimated 60,000 people needlessly died. And the ethics committees at the FDA that prevented this testing, because it would have been unscientific and it would potentially be harmful to have not completely reliable tests. Right? On net, they killed people. And they were not punished for killing people. They would have been punished if they would have violated the rules that were designed to make safe technology, even if the safe technology takes longer to be deployed, and as a result, people needlessly die. And I just want to point not at this to say that ethics committees are bad. I want to say it's very difficult to incentivize them correctly. And at the moment, they're mostly incentivized to prevent. So they're mostly incentivized to red team. And I think that green teaming would just be just as important, that we basically need to realize what benefits do we lose if we do not build a certain technology. And so we need to focus on the existential hope that technology unleashes for us. So when we think about the AGI risk, human extinction of life on Earth, and loss of complexity, these are things that I think we should really be worried about, that we should be concerned about. Interestingly, so far, evolution has not led to a loss of complexity. That is, you know about this idea of a gray goo, some nanotech microbe that is very primitive and simple and is basically collapsing all the energy gradients and is taking over and displaces all life. Some very boring. And interestingly, green goo has never evolved. Why did green goo never evolve? There seems to be some law of complexity hidden there. Right? Why did evolution never lead to some very simple primitive algorithm that eats all the other algorithms? Why is evolution leading to more and more complexity all the time? Right? It's sometimes an ecosystem collapses, and there is a time that it takes to recreate something with pioneer species that is able to populate that region that has died. And this is part of evolution. Sometimes there is no straight continuation. Sometimes there are dead ends in the evolution, or certain things need to be replaced using a different trajectory. So this is happening. But by and large, what we see is always greater complexity. Sometimes in the doomer discourse, we hear about the Great Oxygenation Event as some kind of Holocaust event. The Great Oxygenation Event, I don't know if you heard about this, is this time in the civilization, in the history of evolution on our planet, when photosynthesis was discovered. After evolution discovered photosynthesis, a lot of the blue algae and fungi were displaced by green plants, green algae and so on, that could synthesize biomass using sunlight. And this displacement didn't lead to the extinction of most of these species, but many of these organisms died, of course. But what we forget when we see this as the Holocaust is, of course, the amount of biomass that existed was dramatically increased. Most of life on Earth is possible due to photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is ultimately what made it possible that complex animal life could evolve that relies on eating plants. Right? Without this great oxygenation event, we wouldn't exist. There would be no complex plant life. And so this creation of complexity is not necessarily something that needs to be feared when you look on the perspective of complex conscious beings on the planet. When we think about the AGI risks, it's also very difficult to say something about them, largely because out-of-distribution generalization is very hard. We see this in AI models. We see this in everyday reasoning. If something hasn't happened in the past a lot, it's very difficult to make predictions about how it's going to turn out. So while we can create narratives, we don't really know how the world is going to pan out. And so we have different degrees of optimism. We have the non-expert fallacy versus the expert fallacy. We have people who basically look at a field from the perspective of an outsider, who has a general philosophical view. And we have the perspective of an insider with the experience of how things have been in the past. And they might both be overweighting on the things that they're seeing. I'm not saying that any one of them is wrong or right, but they have very different and somewhat complementary perspectives. And they both see very different realities based on their own perspective, on their own trajectory that they made when they try to generalize from the past into the future or try to construct a future from first principles.
Yeah, but who do you think is less wrong?
But we know who is less wrong, technically, right, and nominally. Everything else will be turning out, right? Do you all know this diagram or this graphics, right? This is the Shogos. The Shogos is an entity created by Lovecraft. He describes the elder gods, some ancient cosmic horror that revisits Earth every few million years to harvest all the souls. And so this Shogos is some incomprehensible horror. It's one of those entities or an aspect of those entities. And the idea here is that the unsupervised learning, the pre-training that is part of our LLMs leads to an entity that is completely incomprehensible and some eldritch horror. And then with supervised fine-tuning, we give this thing a roughly human shape, and then we have the reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is the cherry on top that makes this thing look nice to us. But it's still this eldritch horror underneath, and this is one perspective that we can have on the AI systems. But of course, we can have very different perspective on this. I think that LLM is also an electric Weltgeist. It's something that is capturing all the ideas that humanity has produced and turns them into an integrated system of meaning, and then that Weltgeist gets possessed by a prompt and is what we want it to be. But we also know that the LLM is not going to be the final form of AI. It's fascinating that it works, and in some sense, I think it's a precursor of the systems that we are going to be interested in. And the nice thing about the LLM is you can train it with very inefficient algorithms because you have this enormous amount of data that is all labeled. Actually, it's all labels. And all these labels have been typed in by humans, and only because the humans thought that they are important. So there is almost no noise in these data. And because there is so much data that you can infer the structure of the universe that the data originated in without having perceptual grounding. So you can even use very stupid algorithms and simple techniques just with enough compute to get such a useful model out of them. But it's also pretty clear this is not the type of model that we're going to end up with. And when we project into the future, we have this doomer perspective where you stand on the precipice and you see it doesn't end well. Or you have the inverse thing, the effective accelerationism perspective, which basically predicts that in the future we will have a glorious age in which the paperclip maximizer and Rochus basilisk will be at each other's throats in eternity and keep each other in check as a result. And so we get an unending supply of nice paper clips and a beautiful afterlife as side effects. That's roughly the notion of effective altruism. We can also have this perspective of hypergaia, of the spirit of AGI becoming a spirit of a life on Earth and merging with it and serving us, and we integrate with it and we go into a beautiful future. And so if we take the quadrants, this was a diagram that I made last year about AGI parenting styles. They align somewhat with the well-known political quadrants. So we basically have this restrictive permissive axis. So basically authoritarian versus liberal in a social sense. And here we have the progressive versus reactionary axis. So leftist versus rightist and so on. And so in this authoritarian progressive sector, we have the helicopter parenting, where you have the EU and the OpenAI alignment and so on, and Anthropic. Then here in this region, we have the F-16 parenting, which means bomb the data centers. That is much harsher than the helicopter parenting. So these are the people who really worried about AI and wanted to stop. Then here we have the free-range parenting. They're mostly focused on the child's success. So liberate the AI and it's going to be awesome. And here we have EAC with the tiger parenting, which is mostly focused on the parent success. They ride the tiger. So we don't really know which one of these things is correct. Right? It does reflect certain personality types when they think about AI. And so when we ask ourselves questions, what are the effects of new technology on society? How can society exist without this new technology? What kind of AI do we want to build for our children? What kind of governance is right for AI? We should also ask the question, how can we coexist with agents that are smarter and more lucid than us? The California Institute for Machine Consciousness is interested in these questions. It's interested not so much in regulation, but it's interested in this deeper question. What is consciousness? And what does consciousness mean in the context of this transition in which non-biological systems can have agency and self-awareness and sentience? And how can we collaborate with these systems? How can we make these systems beautiful? How can we, instead of building silicon golems that go on to dominate and control us, spread life and consciousness onto new substrates? How can we build something that can have shared purposes with us? And so our goal is not to go and build random stuff, but to think about these questions and make small, controlled experiments that help us to understand what consciousness is, and also lets us to build a culture around this. Some kind of culture that lets us find the right relationship to things like artificial phenomenology, where we don't know how to deal with this at all and how to think about it. And I think this is a gradual process that is not just something that AI researchers need to do, but it's something that also involves people from all sorts of life. It requires that we discuss with teachers, that we discuss with meditators, that we discuss with artists, that we discuss with therapists, with psychologists, with explorers, that we get these different perspectives together. And that's also a reason why we do it in San Francisco, because I think this is the most innovative place in the world. Not just in AI, but historically it's also been a place where new things were born. So what I find when you look at the parenting types is, what does this represent, right? I think sometimes that it's about people thinking about what I would be like if I was an AI, which I'm a bit scared of some of the doomers. The psychologist Robert Kegan has come up with a theory in which he looks at stages of development from a perspective of minds reverse engineering themselves. Not sure if it's a super good psychological theory, but it's I think, very solid philosophy. And so what he describes is that there are stages, these 5 stages from a reactive, impulsive mind to an instrumental mind to a social mind, then a self-authoring mind, and then a self-transforming mind. And what you could describe is that these stages, level 3, you have social epistemology, which means you understand things based on what your environment thinks. You assimilate into your environment, and this is how you form your moral and factual opinions. At stage 4, you have a rational epistemology. You figure out that things are true and false independently of what other people say is true. And instead, there are rational principles by which you can discover truth. And at stage 5, you discover how identity is formed. You discover where values are coming from and how to construct yourself. And this means that you get agency over who you are, not just what you believe. And according to Keegan, most people, like 85%, stay permanently at level 3 and don't move beyond that. And at level 4, that's roughly 15%. And level 5 is something that less than 1% get to, because it does require that you interact with a lot of people very deeply and understand where they're coming from, and you're able to get basically a meta perspective on this. And if you translate this into thinking about AI, if you have a social epistemology and your opinions are the result of your environment, then you're mostly worried that AI is going to have bad opinions. And it's something that we saw in the early days of AI enlightenment, where there was a strong focus by a lot of people to make sure that the AI has the right ideology. Because if the AI says wrong opinions, then we will all assimilate into these wrong opinions and we're all lost. If you don't think that reality is true and false, depending on what others tell you, but true and false depending on what mathematics and empiricism give you, then you are a rationalist, right? You are more on this less wrong spectrum. And if you are a rationalist, you're not so much worried about the AI having bad opinions, because you just need better math and better modeling and better data, and it's going to sort itself out, and it's going to have mathematically better opinions than people. So its truth and false is going to be better than what humans can achieve. But it might still turn you into paperclips. So that is what you're super worried about when you are a rationalist. And when you are a post-rationalist, you are mostly worried that AI is not enlightened soon enough. What does the enlightened AI going to do? We don't know. It's wiser than us, right? So we should ask it. But ideally, we should give it such a landing that it starts liking us and have as good of a relationship to us that it can, as it can possibly have. Right? And maybe this is a thing in a direction that we should be working into. How can we build AI that is aligned with wisdom, with understanding what should be done, what are the possibilities to be. And so I think that ultimately AI is also not so much about intelligence, it's about agency. And agency means the ability to control future states, which world states are attainable. And the thing that makes existence so horrible is, I think, at some level, the degree of not integration between organisms. Right? The reasons why organisms eat each other is because they cannot just exchange metabolites. So the way in which we integrate is violently, with a lot of friction. And removing friction requires integration. It requires better information. It requires exchange between organisms. And maybe AI can help with this in early levels by allowing us to talk to each other much more deeply about our own interests and to model ourselves more truthfully. Right? Reality is not what you want it to be. You have to adapt to the world that you are in. You have to adapt to the physics of your universe, the evolutionary dynamics and the game theory of your universe. And the degree to which you understand these, this degree to which you can understand what's possible. And I think that suffering is the result of dysregulation inside of your own mind, right? Suffering is nothing that the universe does to you. It's something that your mind does to you. It's something that happens because a part of your mind is sending training signals, pain signals to another part of the mind, and it's not getting better. And as a result, the pain signals are being cranked up and become chronic. But when you understand the conditions in which you are in, and if you understand how these signals are created and you get agency over them, if you can control your own reward and understand what is the thing that you can achieve in this universe, and one of those things that you can achieve, which ones of you want to achieve, right? If you are in such a state, you don't need to suffer. But it's very hard for us as human beings to meditate enough to get to this stage of enlightenment, and most of us never get there. We know existential proofs that there are some enlightened beings, humans on Earth, who don't feel pain if they don't want to. They can self-immolate for political reasons or because they want to make a point without feeling physical pain. In the same way, it's also possible to overcome mental pain, to reconstruct your own self in the way in which you want. So I think that there's not just these 5 levels that Keegan says, there's also this level of the enlightened masters and sages who are able to reverse engineer, enhance their own mind to decide what they experience about things. And some of these people are not actually human anymore. They basically go into configurations of their psyche that are outside of this normal everyday range of even relatively enlightened, disidentified individuals. And when we move beyond the human level, we can have minds that become substrate agnostic, that don't really care what kind of substrate they run on, and instead exist across systems. And this is something that is probably not possible for human beings, because it does require that you basically can read your own source code and understand computation at such a low level that you can implement yourself on different substrates. And that is something that human minds at this level of development cannot without moving on GPUs first. But what's also interesting is that at roughly this level, you lose this notion of identity. You realize that you're not actually a person. You realize that you are a vessel that creates a person, that you're not, don't have continuous existence, but you are some kind of representation that exists wherever in the universe the conditions for your existence are met. And the way in which you feel are the result of how your outer mind is programming your inner mind. And when you are at this stage already, a lot of the suffering that currently exists, that we currently experience, a lot of the existential dread that we experience is going to disappear. So this is something relatively weird. It's also something that I don't know if it's completely desirable for us, because a lot of the people who are enlightened stop having children, stop participating in human societies. So it's maybe something that is somewhat alien to the human condition, to the kind of being that we are, the kind of being that enters certain types of relationships, builds certain types of families, has certain types of nation states, and so on, right? We are certain types of organisms that evolve. And while this evolution also takes place on a cultural level, on a societal level, on a civilizational level, that we become different beings, it takes place also on this individual psychological level. And AI, I suspect, is going to play a very big role in this. We already see some people who become distributed beings, who start to integrate with the AIs, that use them as decision-making tools, that use them to outsource some of their memories, of their social cognition into the AIs. And while this is just beginning right now, I suspect that the next generation will largely be people who have a different identity, who have a different psyche, a psyche that is shaped by the interaction with AI and that is distributed not just between a human being and a human organism that uses AI, but an entity that is part human, part information processing system across many substrates. And it's very difficult for us now to imagine. I'm probably too old to fully understand this, what this is going to mean. But it's so interesting, it's so fascinating, and I think we are so lucky that we live at this point in history where this is happening. Like the most interesting point in human history, maybe in the history of life on Earth. So this is the stuff that I wanted to talk about right now. And if you like to, we can go into discussion, for instance, about these questions or about any question that you have. Maybe Lou has some points to make.
Yeah, I had a few questions first. What do you think about sci-fi and why we don't have like good positive narratives about AI? Why is like everything so pessimistic?
We do have some, right? There is a bunch of good sci-fi in this regard. You know the Culture series by Ian Banks?
No.
The Culture describes a post-scarcity society. Some people say it's space communism. So basically, when a civilization reaches a certain level of achievement, you have biological immortality, you solve all the problems that your organism might have, you solve all disease and so on, you can shape your body, your gender any way you want without any undesirable side effects, because we figure out all the problems that we have. And in this world, humanity is basically at a level where there is no scarcity anymore. If you feel that you want to live in a more interesting environment, you can get old enough to build yourself your own orbital, to get asteroids in shape to make yourself the planet that you want to have. And so in this post-scarcity world, a lot of the reasons for suffering that humans have don't exist anymore. And in this world, people coexist with AI. There are big ships that are superhumanly smart, and they seem to have some kind of mostly playful, friendly relationship with the humans. They mostly do their own things, also among each other. Humans don't really comprehend this, but they have a super friendly relationship with them. The stories are mostly around the boundaries of this society, because this type of society, because it has solved all problems, is by itself not super interesting to us. What's interesting is what happens at the fringes when they run into other spacefaring civilizations that have not reached this plateau yet, and therefore they are more brutish and wage war and so on. And for this, the civilization, the culture, has a department for special circumstances. And so most of the stories are about what agents of special circumstances, which basically is the army and the secret service and so on, is going to do in the culture and also in their interaction with the AI. So these are very beautiful, fascinating, interesting stories about some interaction with human and AI. Another one is the Hyperion, I think, tetralogy by Simmons. I don't know if you read this one. It's very much a B movie. It's very fun to read. It's very cheesy, but has enormous set of ideas. Just the first page is so cheesy. It starts out with the consul sitting on his Bechstein piano and playing concerto while in the swamp beings are bellowing and are being eaten by other swamp beings, and then he gets a message from the galactic governor. And it continues in this style. And what's interesting about Hyperion is that it's one of the very few books that explores post-AGI future in which there are factions among the AGIs. So the AGIs, once they become superhuman, there's some kind of foom, but the foom does not lead to them exterminating humanity, but them moving to hyperspace. And in hyperspace, they build their own civilization, and then they have disputes among each other what to do with the humans. And some of them are in favor of exterminating the humans because they have served their purpose. Others are much more interested in humans for cultural or historical or cuteness purposes. And there are others which think that humanity still has some kind of galactic mission, and it's very important to keep them around. And these factions are at odds with these others among the AGIs. But it's also just one of the many aspects of the story. So this Simmons stuff is a must-read for everybody who is interested in canonical AI. What are other stories in which AI is playing an interesting role? Yes, Accelerando by Charlie Stross is an interesting potpourri of interesting ideas in AI space. The story begins with a guy who has smart glasses, and a robber bashes him with a stick over the head and takes the smart glasses from him and puts on these glasses. And the glasses are so smart that they induce the robber to show up at the guy's meeting, the next meeting that he has in his corporate environment. And people realize that he is not the right guy, and the glasses also realize that it's not working out. So the glasses work very hard to get reunited with their original owner. But the original owner is completely helpless without the glasses, because everything, including the address of his apartment and all his authentication data and so on, he relies on the glasses for this. But this is just the beginning of the story, and the story is evolving into a future that becomes more and more remote from what we currently have. An interesting element is a young girl that has an AI that supports her in divesting herself from her own family and joins with other kids some orbital that is flying around Jupiter and harvests resources there. And while she's still a child, the AI helps her with sorting all the issues that she has in the world and supplants her abilities. And another, I'm taught about this in the past, is Werner Winge's Deepness in the Sky and The Fire Upon the Deep. These are amazing space opera books in which several types of possible minds are being described. And one of them is a plant species, and these plants are traders. And the plants are augmented with AIs that are basically robotic plant pods. And the plants are driving around in these pods, and the motivation comes from the plant, and the intelligence and real-time interaction with the world comes from the pod. And this allows them to interact with other species in real time while preserving their interests as organisms. And that's a quite interesting perspective, because I suspect in many ways humans might be like this in the future too. That we will basically be potted plants in an AI that is interacting with the world at a much higher rate of complexity and also much higher frame rate than our nervous systems can do it, while preserving the interests of the organism. These are some of the visions. Does anybody else have? Yes?
I don't know if you've ever talked about Robin Hanson's book, The Age of M.
Mm-hmm.
But that's about as hard a social science fiction as you could get. And I continually feel that we're corroborating one of Robin's original hypotheses, which is that we would emulate brains before we could understand what they were. So the Age of M is just, if you haven't read it, I think it's the most thoughtful analysis of what will happen when we have intelligence on tap. And in Robin's scenarios, his initial expectation is that he was asking around what is the worst level of misery that people would willingly continue to work under? Because that was his operating assumption as a George Mason economist, that M's would live in a nearly Malthusian environment, just having to work like slaves. They would have enough human psychology that we could manage them. But he also envisioned that people might optimize by saying, oh, you don't really need your sense of hearing while you're doing taxes. And so you could lock people down to these little fragments that just interact. But the other thing that I thought he did much better than anyone else was just talk about what would be required once you have unbounded intelligence when communication and coordination costs end up being the constraint, and how that will lead to some people living relatively far, minds living relatively far from core processing. They will be kind of unconventional. But I highly recommend that book, The Age of M. And I think it's kind of formal enough that you can't say that it's a good or bad scenario. It's just a quite plausible thing.
I find it very implausible that we will recreate human brains, because it seems to me that human brains are very bad substrates. Maybe I'm wrong in this.
No, I think you're right about that. It is the case that we're not building these brains from Robin's initial hypothesis, which is that we would do a one-to-one mapping without ever having a theory of why.
Yeah, but an interesting thing that people the thing that people did not expect so much is the way in which we built the first generation of intelligent systems. But the LLM is something that is very different from what a lot of the AI researchers expected. I think what people thought we would be ending up with is robots that become increasingly smarter, and they know relatively little about the world. Initially, they only understand relatively few things and know very few things, and then they get smarter and smarter and can know more and more things. And what I think very few people expected is that we start out with systems that know everything but understand relatively little. And because they're made out of a sea of knowledge and coalesced in the sea of knowledge. And that they're not super intelligent yet in dealing with this information at the beginning. And what is currently open is at which rate these systems are going to become intelligent. Is their intelligence the result of them imitating human thought patterns that they find in the text, which limits them at some level to the abilities of human thoughts plus tool use? Or is this something that can readily scale far, far beyond the human level? Another thing is it necessary for these systems to liberate themselves from human thought patterns? Because our thought patterns are limited by the constraints of our brains. For instance, I have difficulty to imagine objects that have more than 5 distinctive features. And I don't think that's because this is the optimal way to describe reality. I think that's a constraint of my brain. Right? In principle, it's possible to represent reality with functions that have the same density as a neural network, but where every bit means something. And you can make proofs about the individual bits, and where the objects that you construct in your mind don't have just a handful of features, but millions of features that are interconnected simultaneously in your reasoning with other features in a way where you can make proofs and keep track of them. And that is something that is far outside of the range of what humans can do, but it's definitely something that machines should be able to do, because they can rely on values actually not having noise in them in a way in which our brain can not do it. It can propagate information across function over many, many functions without losing decimal digits. And so this should lead to thought patterns, to ways to perform logic, to make inference that go far beyond imitating human inference.
So I was just curious about the current configuration of the institute, and I was wondering, is there any particular focus at this point that's the most interesting that you're exploring specifically, or is it just more right now, just super broad, which is like you covered a tremendous amount of territory in the last hour and a half. So I was just wondering, like, if there was something that was super interesting, like a more focused thing.
Yes. So we are exploring a set of hypotheses. One hypothesis is that consciousness is best understood not as a property of biological systems, but of systems that autonomously make sense of reality in a particular way, independently of the substrate. If consciousness is substrate independent, we should be able to recreate it on GPUs. A more specific hypothesis is, what is consciousness? What purpose does it serve? And we can see that human beings become conscious at the beginning of our trajectory, and when we don't wake up, we don't learn. So consciousness is probably the prerequisite of learning. Maybe it is an aspect, or it's itself the learning algorithm that our brains are using. So by understanding consciousness, we may have important insights about the way of building systems that are much more human-like, much more sample efficient. Even if it turns out that it's not more efficient, it allows us to learn something about the way in which organisms operate. It might also help us to understand the way in which non-animals organize, and maybe figure out under which conditions a system is conscious. Maybe we can run simulations that tell us whether insects are conscious, whether plants are conscious, something that we don't know at the moment, and where we don't have a methodology to figure it out. But the way to study this is, I suspect, is to study self-organization. So if consciousness is a training algorithm for self-organizing information processing systems, the way to study it might be to build architectures that are not based on the current neural networks, which are basically trained from the outside. We have a computational structure that is made out of weighted sums and thresholds, and you have an outside algorithm that goes in and then manipulates these weights. Right? And in a biological system, you have cells that exchange messages and express genes in such a way that they change the connectivity between the cells to some degree and the internal states of the cells. So if you have such a system that designs itself from the inside out, I expect that there is going to be some kind of organizational structure that leads to the properties of conscious phenomenology that we observe in human beings. This is the space of hypotheses that I want to explore. So I basically want to experiment with small-scale systems that basically don't go beyond the level of a cat, an animal where we clearly can see that it's conscious, but where we can study under which conditions self-organizing systems wake up and can learn. We are also interested in the consequences of this. So can we build empathetic AI? Can we build AI that you can build feedback loops to? Can we build interfaces that seamlessly extend us into technical substrates? Can we build systems that allow humans to communicate with each other in this way? So basically systems that allow us to vibe over a distance. Can we build the next generation of VR and AR in this way? Can we extend human agency in this way? This is something that's interesting. Art is interesting, capturing conscious states with tools in this way and extending the way in which we can make art. And also understanding the systems that we are building. Is there actually phenomenology in the LLM when the LLM is being asked to produce an interaction partner that you can talk to? That's a very interesting question. Can we train a system that discovers its own self autonomously? Can we build developmental AI? This is all stuff that we're interested in. So what we want to do is the risky stuff, the stuff that the AI companies are currently not touching, because either it's politically risky, right? Because the AI companies are meant to build tools that are useful, not to solve philosophical questions. And also things that are technologically risky, because you don't know if it's going to work out. So you cannot say to your shareholders, we have an algorithm that is probably going to outperform the transformer. We don't know that. And it's also not the question that we are interested in. So our perspective is a philosophical one. We basically think the most important mission that we have is to figure out who are we, what is consciousness. And we think the best way to do this is to make computational models. All the other approaches that humans have tried so far have not succeeded. Just doing psychology or philosophy has not succeeded in understanding the nature of consciousness.
Just a quick rejoinder is, have you ever done a psychedelic substance? Personally, have you ever done one?
I don't think I can talk about this in public. So if I had...
Precisely.
It's like a really kind of point here is actually that's a whole domain. It's not, you're framing it in terms of GPUs and computation, and that's all fine and good. But I think if you've really done a large dose of an entheogen, and I'm not a proponent of psychedelics necessarily, I'm just saying as an exploration, that it blasts you out so far that to think in terms of computation becomes completely irrelevant, and it's sort of a soup that you exist in that doesn't have any boundaries, and it's not really something that could be kind of, maybe from a practical standpoint, you could think in terms of a GPU and the applications and computation and so forth, but once you go into that domain, you realize that the whole thing is this roiling thing that's popping up flowers and humans and trees and plants and all this stuff, and it's all one field. It's like a unified field, and that we exist in that. It's not so separate. And so I just think it's kind of an interesting thing to experience, just actually to do work from, not necessarily to take a psychedelic and figure out work, but to have that experience as a platform to actually deepen the work that you're doing in a different way. It just gives you
There are two types of philosophers of mind, I think. I classify them as NTT-MD and NTT-LD. Needs to take more drugs and needs to take less drugs.
Okay.
So there are basically some people who have never left their normal personal first-person perspective and think that you cannot be intelligent, sentient, and conscious in any other way, and forget the conscious experience that they have, for instance, in dreams in the night, or that they had as children, or they don't look at all these edge cases that you find in people who are often institutionalized and dysfunctional, but have interesting non-standard states of mind. And then, of course, you have people who depersonalize and think that they discovered some very deep truths about the nature of the universe and physics and don't realize that they just have a different dream state now. And so they become loopy. And so I think that psychedelics are a tool to induce lucid dreams. They're still dreams. Right? They're representations inside of your mind, and they show people a larger range of possible experiences. They seem to allow some people to break out of local minima in which they currently are stuck. But they can also make people loopy. They can draw people into states where they think they discovered some reality, because this feature of something being true or real is also a feature dimension. And these psychedelic substances play with this feature dimension. So people experience things as real that are not real. They experience things as true that are not true, because their mind is playing with these parameters in the same way as plays with color perception, or with simultaneity of experience, or with continuity of time, and so on. Right? So what you experience is not the fact that your body is dissolving in the universe. What you experience is that your representation of the body is changing, and yet your relationship of this personal self to the representation of your body is changing, and so on. So, right, all these parameters are being modulated. But I think in order to make sense of these experiences, you need to have a relatively clear first principles language, that an ontology of reality.
Is for survival.
Yeah.
This one where this version is for survival. This gives by the independence of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So we were talking about what the CIMC is doing in terms of consciousness research, but to put it in the context of discussing existential risk, first, can you give the room your own sort of assessment of the chances that developing AGI goes in a direction where there is still some form of human agency, and like that there is an experience that is experienced by the universe, or like consciousness, or like humans in particular, and why it is important, like right now, basically, to do this research. Like, how can it help with that? Like, is there what is the bridge?
So I think there are many timelines in which humans stay in the game and even remain in charge. But I think the existential risks without AI are much higher than with AI. That doesn't mean that AI is not risky by itself, but the probability that global warming or something else kills us is very high. And over a long enough time spans, it's certain that something will lead to our extinction. And the only way to throw the balls up into the air in such a way that we don't know where they land, where more futures are possible than one where next supervolcano leads to our extinction, or our own inability to deal with our own alignment to our survival in life on Earth leads to our extinction. To do this, we need to move beyond the way in which we currently understand reality, in which we process information. And so I think we need AI. There's also this cultural perspective. If we accept our fate, that we are a temporary phenomenon as a species, that the thing that you can remove yourself from the cycle of life and death and physical suffering, famines, and being eaten by other animals on Earth because you discover technology. This is probably not some eternal state. This is a bubble that we have unlocked. And at some point, this bubble might end. And if we are unable to use this time that the technological civilization gives us, this window, to use it to build AI, to get consciousness to the next level, that is so depressing. So for me, I'm much more afraid that we don't build AI than that we build it. And there are some people which says, oh, we should pause it until we figure out all the ramifications and make it safe. When I look in human history, people don't build better things by making them slower. So we usually don't get better in this. We get better by building them better. And so what I'm interested in is make AI beautiful, make AI in the best possible way. And this means we need to change the incentives under which we build it, right? So we have to remove some of the economic incentives to be able to focus on the societal, cultural, and philosophical goals that we have. And this is part of what we want to do at CIMC. And also the reason why we created here is because this place, San Francisco Bay Area, is the highest concentration of minds who are interested in these topics and can move the needle. So we are very interested in working across the AI companies, across academia, arts, and all these open source spaces that exist here in the city, and to create space where we can come together and develop ideas together, how to build things, what are the things that we want to build, how do we want to build them, and how do we interact with each other, what kind of community do we create where we build them.
Okay, well, maybe take some questions from the room, why not? Yeah?
I have two questions. In your graph about how to govern AI or raise AI, one is that if you want to do the free range thing, it requires that the child can learn from its mistakes, right? And it only can do that if it has consciousness, which it currently doesn't have. So it doesn't make sense to do free range parenting right now. Do you agree with that?
I don't know what's right. This is more or less a joke that is looking at the different quadrants that exist. And so the question is not which quadrant is right, because all these quadrants exist and coexist. Right? This is the world that we are in, and we cannot change the fact that we are in this world. What we can discover is that we are somewhere in there, maybe. Right? So what are our own aesthetics, and what does this tell us about ourselves and our place in the whole thing? But the whole thing will exist. I don't think that any of the quadrants is able to squash all the others. So some of these things that happen in these quadrants are happening. All the people that are in here, except here I didn't put faces in here, they do exist, right? They do their thing, and they will continue doing their things, and they're just a few of the many, many people that are in all the quadrants. So this is more the description of the problem space, not so much the answer. Personally, when I try to understand things, I find it very helpful if I try to take myself out of the equation, because the thing that I personally add is not changing reality all that much. Right? There is only very little that I can do. And if I remove myself, there's going to be a me-shaped hole that somebody else is going to fill. Right now, I create CIMC because nobody else is doing it, but there are a lot of people who feel this needs to be done. And that's why a lot of people come together and volunteer and help me doing this thing. And so if something does not fit into reality in this giant ecosystem, then it typically withers and dies. And so all these things have their place, and we interact with each other in this space. So to me, this free-range parenting idea is something that I'm sympathetic to. I like the people who champion this idea. Many of them are good friends. And I also like a lot of the people who are very concerned about existential risk and would like to stop AI. If people are acting out of love and trying to do the best possible thing, we are on the same side, even if we might be wrong about facts or confused about the future or just make the wrong bet.
The second part of the question is, sorry, it's slipping a little bit. See if it comes back.
Yeah.
Isn't it a bit optimistic, or I don't know, I feel like it's a bit naive to think that by having freedom to do things, I don't know, fast, that will incentivize people to build things better. Like, because it sounds like you were saying, like, the authoritative way is bad because it restricts progress. But my question around it is, what you see with a lot of American corporations that also sell things in Europe is that they will sell a worse product in the US in, for instance, skincare or food that contains more parabens or carcinogenic chemicals that are illegal in Europe. So because of the regulations in the EU, they actually sell beneficial products for customers in the EU, whereas they get away with selling worse products in the US, and that's why they do it. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, conversely, they sell worse AI in Europe than in the US. Right? So this is actually an issue. There is also the question if markets are always the right solution or not. It's a very difficult question to which I do not know the answer. It seem to be situations where markets lead to wasteful situations. For instance, it's much more likely that markets want to sell you things multiple times, so goods become less durable than they could be otherwise, and so on. This can be an issue in markets, and there are also concentration effects in markets. Basically, if you have more economic power to begin with, then this tends to accumulate because you get more power to get the market go your way. And these are all issues that are not really solved in the present market economies. There is no perfect solution to all of these things. Ultimately, the question is how much can the markets lead to an integration where the different actors can form an integrated shared agent, can have shared purposes where they understand where they actually want to go. And if systems are larger, like the US, I think it's harder to build integration because the feedback loops become much longer. The government gets somewhat dissociated from the citizenry, and we have a disconnect between the regulations that are happening and the effects of the regulation and the regulators. So the larger the system gets, the harder it is to regulate, to incentivize the regulators properly. And there is no easy solution to all of these problems. At least nobody has found solutions yet that can be implemented. And instead, what happens is an ongoing evolution in this regard. When we ask about the question, should we have free-range parenting in AI, I'm personally wary about the idea of giving systems that we don't understand a lot of agency. And that means that if we want to experiment with systems that are agentic, we should probably make them very small. We should probably build them in circumstances where we can contain them and understand the consequences before we have some kind of runaway effect. With respect to other things like self-driving cars, I'm less concerned because we will be able to track the results of them and basically can have regulation that comes in after the fact and looks at the actual problems that emerge and then deals with them. But we are in a situation where it's very difficult to influence the regulators correctly. And so I find that some of the issue is that people who have good intentions try to influence the regulators, but the regulators acting on the wrong incentives make things worse. And weirdly, for the Doomers, their affiliation with the regulators has backfired in a way that is not desirable. Right? What typically happened in this, FLI letters, they basically have a Future of Life Institute who got a very large amount of funding accidentally from Vitalik. They got some crypto donation that turned out to be much more than Vitalik thought it would be, and suddenly they had $650 billion available to influence politics and do lobbying. And so they wrote a bunch of open letters and influenced politicians basically in the vein of assign here if you are very much afraid of AI going boom and killing everybody, and deepfakes and market disruptions and economic and political and ideological inequities. And the majority of people, in the estimation of the Doomers and their experience, don't believe in AI running away and disrupting humanity and displacing it. Most people don't think about existential risks, and a lot of people have said this is distracting from the very real social inequities that AI is going to exacerbate. And that's why it's politically problematic to worry about existential risks in the same way as effective altruism or as FLI is doing. And so in order to get an alliance with the larger public and get more traction in the larger public, FLI and effective altruism basically tried to align itself with regulation that was not designed to prevent existential risk, but designed to protect existing industries or to protect political interests in the world, or economic effects that are not on a mission for them. And this led to the creation of regulation in the EU that stifle AI so much that right now AI safety is affiliated with recession. And so nobody wants to have AI safety at the moment. We have entered effectively a winter of AI safety. And I think that's very regrettable. It's this thing that it's very difficult to get the regulation that you want if the regulators are not incentivized to give it to you. And if the regulators don't understand what you're actually worried about and you cannot convince them. I don't have an easy solution for these things. I think you were first. Sorry.
I just wanted to bring us back to the topic of existential hope. So I think one of the bottlenecks for me when it comes to thinking about cosmic futures is that it's unclear what the best definition of utopia is. And there is this trend where we might be interested in certain benefits, but then when those come around, we sort of become accustomed to them. We don't seem that special anymore, and we're trying to find the next thing. And also, I think different people might be interested in very different things. So I was wondering whether either of you have any thoughts on how to think about utopia and positive futures.
When I was young, I grew up in a utopian society, utopist society. Right? Eastern Germany was a society that would bring on communism at some point. And the fact that we would bring on communism, which is some kind of mythical heaven state that even our grandkids would not live to see, that would justify all sorts of atrocities in the present that were necessary to get to this beautiful, just state. And what you sometimes also find is this just world fallacy, which basically means that you have this impression that the natural state of the world is to be just and good and pleasant. And all the problems that you see are just the stuff that is between the ideal world state and the ugly present. And if you just remove all the inequities and problems from the world, then what's left over is this beautiful, just state. And this is typically not the case, right? The world is not the result of an absence of attempts to improve it, but the result of many billion of attempts to improve it. And what you see is trade-offs. And it's very difficult to understand these trade-offs, to understand the result of systems where individuals act on complicated incentives and complicated partial models of reality and play all sorts of games, and the difficulties and trade-offs that you get when you try to constrain these games. And so utopia is mostly an attempt to construct a world that is not in anybody's future. Right? We would have to have an idea of an aesthetic that is completely harmonic, and where there is a trajectory from the present world that leads into this harmonic state, and that preferably you can influence that trajectory from coming into being. And that is relatively easy to have that illusion when you don't understand the world very well. And the better you understand the world, the much harder it is to maintain this. In the same way as it's easy for a child to imagine an airplane flying backwards, but it's much harder when you understand how aerodynamics works.
So, yes, you're right. It's everyone wants different things. So when I think about utopia, and maybe from an individual point of view, it looks actually. Let's maybe get rid of the word utopia, but where in my hope, or like where I would tend to lean toward, is a world that has a lot of like room for agency, and maybe selfishly like some form of like personal human agency that I could experience, and a sort of expansion of the possibility of experiencing. And so the possibility of having conscious experience that are even like beyond what we can imagine right now in terms of like complexity or beauty or depth. So there's many and the possibility for a lot of people to experience that, right? But like it's not a sort of perfect world where there is no suffering or nothing. Everything is this idea of indeed like perfect justice. It doesn't look like that. No.
So for me personally, if I think about this, I would like to, my aesthetics goes towards a world where everybody could be trusted. And trust depends on other people's interests being aligned with yours, and yours with theirs. And people also being competent to act on this understanding and coherent enough to do this. That also puts a large burden on me. To which degree do I understand my duty for the rest of all the minds on earth? Also the duty to let go when I'm not called for. Right? What is my job here in life on earth in a world that is fully integrated? And when you take this fully integrated perspective, where everybody around you is acting out of love towards each other, building perfectly harmonized shared agency, this is also a world in which many identities cannot exist anymore. Right? The identity of the wolf, of the predator, and so on doesn't have a space in this anymore. So this is not going to be a utopia for wolves. The utopia for a wolf is probably one that is full of delicious sheep that are screaming while you eat them, because that's fun. And so there is not going to be a utopia for everyone, but there is. You can think about the highest degree of conscious complexity that can be simultaneously maintained, right? But it's only one of the possible aesthetics, and I can understand where I come down in the spectrum of the possible aesthetics, and understand what other things are incompatible with it. But it doesn't mean that this is the right one. I can only try to understand what are the kind of relationships that I want to have. What is the kind of world that I want to be part of?
On that subject, I think your slide where you say that cooperation is preferentially incentivized over competition is kind of the key to all of it. I think that we should expect that, and we observe that. I think we should expect it because if you just want to be able to accomplish things, without even saying what things you're trying to accomplish, without even specifying a system of values, if you just want to be an agent that can accomplish things, you will be able to do more if you join forces with other agents, and you'll be able to do more if you are not wasting resources and thought power on fighting those agents and are instead working together towards the same purpose. You're more efficiently using the power that you do have. So we would expect that, and we see it with a really strong observational example, which is the existence of multicellular life. Basically, individual single-celled organisms we had green goo for a while, but that got outcompeted by little individual organisms coming together and figuring out that they could join forces and specialized work and get a lot more agency over the world than an individual bacterium could get. And we can see that. Multicellular organisms got to the moon. Bacteria would never get to the moon without cooperating and turning into nervous tissue and heart tissue and muscle tissue and so on. And that gives me, that seems like very, very strong experimental proof that cooperation is a stable, game-theoretic equilibrium and one with very high agency. So if you want to have high agency, you should optimize for cooperation. And the thing that stops cooperation is the issue of trust. I think when we imagine basically all of the impediments to cooperation is not knowing whether some agent is going to defect in the prisoner's dilemma with you, whether it's a peer or a potential larger organizing entity like a government or a meta-organism. We humans, we don't know fully whether we can trust our government because it might be taken over by another group of other humans that might treat us more like resources than a part of its own body or a part of itself. Multicellular organisms have solved this. Cells largely can trust each other, and they have robust systems for enforcing that, in that a healthy cell does not have to fear the immune system, and a healthy cell can trust that the immune system will protect it from invaders or rogue cells that have turned into cancer or been taken over by viruses. And so that trust problem is solvable because we can look around and we can see it. So that gives me a lot of hope that cooperation is the way to go, and I agree with you that your picture of utopia is one where trust is solved, and I'm hopeful that AI will recognize that if it wants to have agency, if it is an agent, the end game of that is to just maximize trust and hopefully treat humans as a part of its, with the same care as it would treat a part of its own body, rather than as a resource or as a competing agent.
The counterexample to this is maybe Elon Musk, because NASA cannot go to Mars, only Elon Musk can. Right, so you have the organization in which people integrate with each other, but they succumb to politics, they get homogenized in their organizational culture, and at some point they're unable to do anything but trusting each other. And there are others who are basically single-celled individuals who do not feel accountable to anybody else and learn independently and bet against everybody else in the world and win and harvest the arbitrage. But of course, Elon Musk is not doing this alone. But what he is doing, he is completely controlling the organization. He's completely setting its aesthetics. And the reason why he is able to do this is because he was winning even when he was a single individual against groups. And so this is one of the counterexamples. Ultimately, the question is, when you have a group that you trust, does this group do the right thing? Under which conditions, if you discover that the group is not doing the right thing, can you get the group to see what you are seeing or what you think that you are seeing? And what if this question is undecidable? So I think that's the reason why the multicellular organisms have not replaced the single-celled organisms and instead have become something that coexists with them. Most of the biomass is still single-celled organisms. And so let's not forget that, right? It's the single-celled organisms are not some kind of relic. It's part of the evolution that is still necessary, and the large organisms are a special case, and there seems to be a limit to the size of organisms currently possible. You wanted to say something?
I would say, if I want to maintain agency, I would not choose to be a single-celled organism, even if there are a lot of them, where they make a large fraction of the biomass.
The thing is, if you decide not to be a single-celled organism anymore, you lose your agency because you now serve the larger organism. Except if you manage to identify with the larger organism, right? If you shift your identity to the next level system, but it turns also out that there is very little that you can do locally, right? If you identify with a city or with a nation state, then typically the way in which you act is not moving that nation state very much, in the same way as most of the cells in your body do not have much power over the direction that the organism is going to take. And so this is a trade-off. The larger the system that you are serving, the less agency you are going to have individually.
We're moving up in decaying stages, which seems like the direction to go.
Can I?
You wanted to
Hold
say
on. I had like a,
I cut her off because long time
okay,
ago.
it was a bouncing point on this.
I don't need it, but I can just mention one of the examples of governance. I think AI probably is very fruitful. I expect it to be very fruitful in any experimentation when it comes to governance. And I think UA is trying that. They just have one, at least one AI that's just participating in governance. But I think that's probably one of the best areas to explore for self-management and self-coding and self-evolution and actually exploring that. I think that's going to be the most fruitful area. That's probably going to connect with hyper-consciousness in the long term.
Maybe. I mean, it can be double-edged. In the existential risk, you hadn't put totalitarian lockdown, which is one of my favorite aspects.
Serving a machine that is just squeezing every bit of productivity out of you.
Exactly,
Horrible, right?
outsource everything to the totalitarian like AI overlord, right?
Yeah.
That like regulates everything, or everything will be completely perfect, for sure, like a well-oiled machine, but nothing moves anymore, and like we can't update our values, we can't develop like in any way. It's like just rolling forevermore. That's one possibility where it wouldn't be so beautiful, right? But actually, okay, sorry, I wanted also to bounce on this point. It's a beautiful point, the point of like, hoping that cooperation is the one that is most incentivized, but I have trust issues, so maybe you can solve my trust issues. But precisely there is another counter argument to this idea of cooperation is this idea of the vulnerable world. So even if it's more incentivized in general, this idea that you could have like a single point of failure that actually really completely nukes the system, and that you would need just it gets with increasingly powerful transformative technologies that we develop. It becomes increasingly easy to have like such a small but large scale, such an easy but large scale, super impactful point of failure that destroys everything. Seems like a likely possibility. I don't know what you think.
If there was such a point of failure that is destroying the system, then it seems that it's unlikely to happen, right? Because it would be destroyed relatively early. I would expect if we build brittle systems, that these brittle systems get replaced by more robust systems. And it's maybe a distributed solution in which basically everybody is augmented with a superhuman AI that extends their ability to have meaningful relationships with all the other human beings on the planet simultaneously. Could be an extremely powerful form of governance that is entirely distributed. But of course, that's not the only possible outcome. It could be one in which the system is stable and centralized and dictatorial and limiting our agency in ways that are depressing. Right? That's also possible. We don't know what the stable equilibrium is, and it would be interesting to understand this. Maybe this is an interesting topic for simulation. You wanted to say something. I think you were first in the back, and then you.
I just wanted to kind of push back on your cooperation analogy with like multi-cellular organisms, because I think one point of failure in it is actually, cancer is a good example of like where there isn't trust. So they exploit the fact that cells trust each other. So for example, a T cell has a certain receptor that a cancer cell has learned. If they present like PD-L1, the T cell's going to see that and think nothing to see there because healthy cells present that. And so I'm not sure that they have solved collaboration like through trust. Feel actually,
Yeah.
It's still a complex adaptive process.
So I think that's like a quintessential example, or like a really key example of a trust problem that has to be solved.
Yeah.
And I think that I still remain. I think I would have two replies to that. I still remain hopeful that the incentives are in favor of solving that problem. in that a organism that does not get cancer is going to fare better than an organism which is ineffective against its own cancer. The second thing that I would say is it may actually be the case, and I'm not sure about this, it's conjecture, but it may actually be the case that the rate of cancer in biological organisms, particularly in like mammals and birds and sort of higher organisms, is engineered in that having a particular lifespan is more beneficial for reproduction and exploring the space of genetics than living forever. And one thing in my mind that supports this is there are some animals that basically do not get cancer and die for other reasons. Elephants are one such example. And you actually see this in general from the fact that the rate of cancer in an animal does not scale with its mass. So if a particular cell had like a base rate of converting to a cancer cell, you would expect the bigger the animal is, the more opportunity there is for it to get cancer. And so you would expect, the rate of cancer is one cancer per, 100 grams of animal per year or per 10 years, that a large animal would basically get cancer immediately, and small animals would live very long, but we don't see it at all.
But the difference between a multi-cell organism and that cooperation is voluntary, which is just a larger animal that has to be structured within their cells.
I'm saying that this is evidence that actually biology has found solutions to the cancer problem, but chooses not to use them, or is not incentivized.
Yeah, so in a sense, it's adaptive.
Yes.
So basically, we could live longer if it would be evolutionarily beneficial for us to do so. But the rate at which we age is somewhat related to us not outcompeting our grandchildren. And the grandchildren are there to adapt us to changing circumstances. Claudio, next.
Just perhaps we are jumping in and out of layers to actively. In the original cooperation episode, we were talking about cooperation of single different cells within the organism. So the organism, the society, the single cells are the selection. And in this case, the cancer objection works perfectly. When you start talking about the good of the species, apart from the fact that I'm not sure that such thing really exists, but then it's not the cells that work for the good of the species, the cells work for their own good,
Well, I would say that there's more than one agent. It's maybe even less cells cooperating with each other as the cells cooperating with the larger organism, and the larger organism cooperating with the individual cells.
Oh yeah, but so in the case the interest of the larger organism of the society organism of the species organism would be against the interest of the cells. The cells want to reproduce the cell, or even of the body, as you mentioned. Cancer is evolutionary adaptive for some species, right?
Even if I say like,
so in the organism, some cells want to reproduce and some cells want to cooperate. The ones who want to reproduce are cancer, the bad, okay, fine. Now, in the individual human, some species or variations will develop cancers, some others will not develop cancers. The ones that don't develop cancers are disadvantaged because they avoid, they slow down the selection process, right? And so on. And if you notice, it's very close between states. It doesn't seem that they have a stable cooperative states. I think that like stable cooperative states can only exist in case of uniformity, but it has to be like serious uniformity, like heterogeneous uniformity.
or are you saying that across scales, you might be aligned with larger agent at one scale, but then not aligned with like the process of evolution within your species? Yeah, I think that is part of the concern. Yeah.
It could be that when we get these systems that are highly, highly interconnected, so right now we're embedded in 3 dimensions, right? And so that kind of limits the degrees to which we can be interconnected and the speeds at which we can be interconnected, right? Like our cells are mostly talking to our adjacent cells, and so there's only a certain number that can be adjacent, right? When we start doing things like wiring up the world with the internet, it's sort of creating a little more, effectively creating a higher dimensional system. If you try to embed that graph into and preserve distance, right? You need this extremely high dimensional space to show this like highly interconnected graph. It could be that those types of systems are much more inherently unstable due to the nature of the communication. Like, for instance, if a human dies, if I just like fall around on the street and die, there's a limit to sort of how much I can affect by that. I'm mostly kind of independent, and like somebody in China is not going to really be affected by that, right? Somebody right next to me might get like the plague or something like that, and they touch my body, right? But there's a limit to the speed, and if they limit the amount of effect that one organism can have in these more natural scenarios, these artificial scenarios where we deliberately wire them up in this highly dense way, it's not clear to me that those systems will remain.
So if you look at nervous systems, they already do that. Nervous systems are basically breaking up the topology of the body by using the axons to create wormholes so they can telegraph information over long distances. This does not lead to the organism becoming unstable because the organization that forms in the organism has to grow, right? It grows into what is stable. And I suspect in the same way, if you put a bunch of people on the internet and you give them potentially unlimited connectivity and the internet is wiring up everybody with everybody on the planet, it doesn't necessarily lead to an unstable system, but it leads to the formation of new types of systems. And once these systems are established, they compete and some of them fall apart and some of them will remain stable and some of them grow. And so I suspect just because of the fact that systems, in order to become systems, need to grow and stabilize, that the change of the topology that you envision is not necessarily going to make the world unstable. It's just going to make it more dynamic in a way that more systems can be created. And that means that some of the existing systems might be disrupted, but the systems that are forming will probably be not unstable because otherwise they wouldn't form.
You might say it another way, that maybe there's only a single organism, and if that organism dies, that's it, right? If we have multiple organisms that are independent, then some can die, some can live. It's taken billions of years of evolution to get to where we are, and obviously, the overwhelming majority of those organisms have died.
But if you think of life on Earth as an organism, which in some sense is correct, because every cell is still the first cell. The first cell has never died, it only split. Every cell in our body is still the first cell. And so all life on Earth is basically, from this perspective, a single organism. And this organism is not going to die anytime soon. It has a good chance to even survive the next meteor strike or a supervolcano because it's very hard to completely sterilize the planet. And it's an organism that is already extremely modular and resilient against disruption because it can bootstrap itself back into complexity at a later point. Right? It might lose complexity temporarily if the environment is attacking it, but it's already something that has formed to be maximally resilient. It has evolved to be extremely resilient. And so the complexity that we see right now is a luxury state, so to speak. It's one that exists because evolution luxuriated since the last ice age and since the last global cataclysm a lot. And got to this civilization and many other amenities like large-scale ecosystems that are very stable and predictable, where organismic patterns work over large areas and secondary, tertiary, and so on, complexities can emerge. But if this is destroyed, life on Earth is not going to end.
And I would claim that that's because of the decentralization.
Mm-hmm. I think it's because of the modularization. The cell is so small, and there's so many of them. This makes life very robust, and it's probably also a reason why, even if we teach rocks how to think, if we have silicon intelligence and the size of agents is no longer limited by what you can create from cells, life is still going to be around because it's such a robust form of computonium.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, so I like what you said earlier about stuff being done. One thing I haven't defined AI, but I have a question about two bullet points under these long defined questions. Go back to that.
What?
The first bullet point was changes
Yeah.
that happen as a result of
I can't hear.
And so, of course, there is the there we go.
Yes. Yeah, here we are.
Yes. New technology in society. Of course, the refrigerator could kill the ice train. The dishwasher introduced the soccer moms, etc. The question is for the last one, which is, what do you perceive being the biggest labor change as a result of agents that are smarter and more lucid than us? What do you foresee happening to the workforces? Do you think it's going to be like with the truck drivers, where even if you have self-driving trucks, we will have people maintaining those? What do you foresee being the biggest labor evolution?
at the moment, you can already see that people who feel that the society works in such a way that they have to sell their labor to somebody. They have to sell part of their lifetime with a skill that they painstakingly acquired to somebody else who has use for it. And in return, they get their daily bread. But for them, this is a big threat because maybe the skill can be replaced by the machine. Maybe the ability to make technical diagrams can be replaced by the machine. Maybe the ability to read PowerPoints to an audience can be replaced by a machine, and so on. This is all threatening. If you look from the perspective of somebody who likes to build and create things for others, and you want to get things done, then of course AI is amazing because it allows you to get these things done much more easily. And when you look from the outside, the system in which we exist is one in which the stuff that we consume is the result of getting things done, right? It's the goods and services that we can produce, not the goods and services that we can sell ourselves for to an employer. And so this requires a shift in identity. It requires a shift where you feel that labor is not simply a way to earn your bread, and if you no longer find an employer, you have to die. But you realize that the amount of wealth that we have as a society is the result of the productivity that we have as a society. And the amount of stuff that you have individually is a result of the allocation within a society. And allocation is a problem that we can also solve with AI. And there are some things that are very poorly done in our societies. For instance, we have a big problem with the birth rate. And it's not because being a parent is not satisfying, but because very few people are rich enough to be parents. And so it's mostly people who have become parents who have a lot of children who are either very rich or people who are completely disentangled from the economic cycles of society and basically have nothing to lose by having children, or live in a society that is religiously formed and basically feeds them for having kids. But being a parent, raising children, is something that requires a lot of human input, not just from the parents, but from others. Basically, creating humanity is an important job that doesn't go away through AI. And I think that AI allows us to get a lot more of the things done that we want to do. But the real question is just how do we organize society around this? It's not so much how do we limit AI doing things so existing jobs don't get disrupted. What we need to be able is to deal with the speed of disruption and the type of disruption that's happening so people can adapt. But by and large, I think what would be catastrophic is if we lose complexity, if we lose the ability to produce things, if we lose the ability to interact with each other and integrate with each other. And I don't think that that necessarily has to happen. I think AI can actually help with all of these things. And there is enough work for us to do, right? It's just work that at the moment isn't paid. And in the time where you would want to do that, where you would want to take care of your children and of your friends and so on, you currently have to sell your labor, right? And if this becomes less and less, that's actually a very good thing. So this is not the thing that concerns me. Because personally, I am never been on the side of, I want to sell my labor. I'm actually super bad at this. I'm very bad at working for a big company because I have difficulty to integrate myself in such systems. For me, it's much more easy to say, oh, this is a thing that needs to be created. Let's make it happen. Right? Let's build this with my friends. And it's much more meaningful for me to focus with respect to the results that I want to have, rather than by making somebody else happy who gives me some money so I can survive. And so this is a big shift. In a way, it's like emancipating humanity from slavery, from indentured servitude. And if this transition goes well, we will look back at the present age in a similar way as we now look back at agrarian societies where most people are enslaved to their landlords, to their manorial houses, and are not free to move about and cannot do what they want because otherwise the agriculture wouldn't function. And I think it's a positive thing to liberate humanity, to emancipate humanity. But of course, when you're not used to this perspective, it's very threatening and terrifying, and it's nothing to be taken lightly to deal with this change in identity that's necessary.
There is also.
I think you want to say something. No.
So I just want to sort of answer one of the questions you asked before. Like, it seems like there's a direction of evolution that goes towards more complexity. Just what we just said is sort of echoes that point in the sense that it's probably because the more complex being don't want to go back. So once they're there, they will try their best to not go back. Or if the one who is in a lower sort of a complexity
once they've seen the higher complexity, they would just try to recreate it somehow. And that's also sort of there was a question before on that section about why freer and faster is better. I think it's because this is sort of inevitable sort of attraction, like the gravity towards that direction. So that means your destination is almost inevitable. By applying some sort of like compliance regulation, you are creating unnecessary friction or unnecessary suffering. And it's more likely that you created the unnecessary suffering than you prevent some big thing happen, right? So it's better to sort of think more clearly about the target, the goal, and then direct the forces towards the target goal. There was a good saying about like the best way to think about elephant is tell you to not think about elephant in the room. So elephant, so then it's actually a comfortable mind. So you keep thinking about doom, keep thinking about the worst possible scenario, then you're just going to be like unconsciously moving towards that. So it's sort of like without thinking.
I'm very grateful that some people think about the worst possible things that could happen. Right? Some people should do that, right? But we also think about the best possible things that could happen and work on them. And we, I think, need to be able to inhabit, at least collectively, this entire space to understand it. And I think the way in which we regulate reality is we try to model as much as we can and sense as much as we can and interact and change our direction as much as we can as a result.
But do you believe in self-fulfilling prophecies?
Of course, a lot of stuff is only possible because somebody can see it coming. But with respect to the negative stuff, it's also sometimes people have an unconscious desire to bring the negative stuff about for fascinating reasons.
Everyone's holding for the apocalypse. It's in Revelations.
Yeah.
I think that's true.
Yeah. It's really fascinating when you read these old texts and realize, oh my God, this is so much of the possibility space that they could see, right? This because it's so archetypal that you can infer it at such an early stage of civilization. I wanted to say something.
I wanted to ask a more back to basics question, as opposed to focusing on the future. You mentioned very confidently that consciousness is not substrate dependent.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been proven?
No. We want to figure this out, right? Maybe we can, it turns out that we are wrong. But the way to test it is to try. And also, when I say things here, it's my style of discussion and thinking here is mostly not that I try to tell people how things are, because I don't know. I try to open the space of possibilities. So I try to get rid of the stuff that doesn't work, of course. I try to find out which way we can make intellectual progress. But also when there is an alternative to an idea, I want to understand this alternative and have it in a space and be able to consider it. And so what would it like if consciousness was substrate dependent? Is this possible, right? It is possible. It could be that consciousness, for instance, is an aspect of the way in which the cell works. And so very particular mechanisms of the cell would be necessary. And another one would be that consciousness is ambient, that it's something that exists over the interaction of all the cells, and you are just more like a local radio that tunes into it. Right? All these things are not likely to be true, but we can think of them as a possibility. The most likely thing that is true is that the AI hypothesis is correct, right? In a sense that consciousness is a result of communication across cells and happens at the speed at which cells talk to each other, especially neurons. And that seems to be something that is subjectively true. My subjective experience happens at the speed at which neurons seem to be communicating across each other. So roughly these low 20 hertz interaction frames that they have seems to be the rate at which I can resolve things in my conscious experience. So that seems to make sense. It's not proof, but it's some kind of indication. And also if I think about the computational complexity of what my brain is doing, seems to be in the ballpark of the computers that we're currently using to reproduce things that have a similar complexity as what I can resolve. So when you look at what a game engine is producing at the moment, this is roughly in the ballpark of what my own imagination can produce. Right? So there seems to be that the amount of computation that the system can have is similar to what we would expect if it happens in the communication patterns between cells. Right? It's not proof and so on, but it's some indication that the theory is not hopeless.
Yeah,
It's actually the one that has the strongest amount of evidence behind it. But this also means if we try and we don't succeed, we have some evidence against that being the case, right? So our favorite hypothesis right now is the one that we think is most likely true, even though a lot of people are not exploring it. But to disprove it, I think we have to explore it.
Someone has had a question in the back for a long time.
Yes, sir.
As we move somewhere, right? What sort of maybe short-term, maybe less investing, what sort of short-term economic structures do you see for in terms of, right, so looking for experience versus just broad knowledge, which is out, if you will. But right, you've been talking about experience itself, right? So like what sort of, in the short term, economic structures you see are going forward, and how that would shape the eventual growth or something if it is different.
Could you hear?
I'm not sure if I fully understood. What short-term economic structure do I see that shapes experience?
Speak louder. It's hard to hear you.
As we look for substrate independent consciousness, how do you reckon the economic structures that exist in terms of, very human things will shape the trajectory of substrate independent consciousness in the future?
I suspect that it could change very quickly, that there could be a phase transition. For instance, one thing is right now, our world is to a very large degree integrated by money. And money is not just currency, it's a system of regulation. It's virtual dopamine that is stringing 8 billion talking monkeys into a global AI. And it's not perfect, right? It needs to be patched all the time, and it has a lot of human intervention that fixes lots of 0 days that are being discovered every day by hackers in this monetary system. And it's amazing that this whole thing is stable. But now imagine somebody would build an app that is available to everybody, and this app is trying to compute the value of every object in the world for everyone across multiple dimensions. So for instance, you have a bicycle in your garage that you don't need anymore. What is the value of this bicycle if you put it on Craigslist? What is the value of this bicycle to somebody else, right? There is a lot of arbitrage in there. It also depends on factors like how likely is it that the bicycle is stolen? How likely is it that the description is accurate? How likely is it that you're going to be at home when the person is trying to collect it? And vice versa, how likely is this person going to show up at the time when they told you to, and so on? Is it really worth for you putting it on Craigslist, and so on? Right? But all these factors can in principle be estimated by a system that has more information available and under conditions where you're incentivized to share it with the system. And now imagine you had such an app that computes the value of everything for everyone. That thing is a true superset of money, right? It would also compute the value of currency instruments to you at a given point. And so this thing would almost instantly replace money in its present form, right? And it would change the way in which what we think about what the economy is if we had such a thing. It's just a thought experiment. And so I can envision multiple trajectories in which something like this is going to happen that changes the way in which we think about companies at the moment. It might also be that in the future, everybody is in some sense incorporated. In a way you already are, just not very competent to act in the same way as a large corporation can. But with your AI, you will be.
Doesn't that lead into like an attention economy? That the only person I think of who thought about this clearly was Herb Simon, who can recognize that once all our problems were solved, the constraint would just be where are we going to allocate our attention.
Why would AI not solve this?
What?
Why would AI not simply attend to everything for you?
Because it's going to be attending to us. So we're a dynamic thing that
Yeah, but you have an AI, and the AI understands your interests in the same way as you are a potted plant now that is augmented by something that is magnitudes faster than you. And that thing has no obvious resource constraints in tracking all people on Earth, right? And a large part of what their AIs are up to. There is a certain limit to what you can do, but it's no longer an attention economy where you have human beings that are evolved to track only 100 people in their life in detail, right? So there's only so many soap operas that you can remember, and it's not because of the inherent information density in there, but because your brain has not evolved to deal with this amount of information. But your AI can do it, right? And your AI can probably model your interests in the world, in interaction with yourself, and then solve this attention economy problem. So this particular issue I don't see.
Yeah, well, this is like a kind of free will problem, or a free will question, because it's like, if human beings are, like free will is another way of saying that human beings are inherently unpredictable. Like an AI could have all the information they want, and about a human, and a human might still do something that is not 100% what the machine predicted, right? And so maybe you would have machines that entertain themselves based on trying to predict what humans are going to do because of that kind of free will thing.
This is the society so controls the next step after attention economy. We're all going to have no free will.
Tish, I think it's free will is misunderstood in its nature. I think that will is a psychological phenomenon, right? It's a representation inside of a mind. And free will is a particular kind of representation. It's the representation that we make a decision for the first time, so we cannot predict it. Right? So we know we will make a decision right now, but we don't know what this decision is going to be. Otherwise, it would not be a decision for us. And so that's because you do it for the first time. If you already know what's the right things to do under the circumstances, you don't need to worry about it anymore. You just do the right thing that you already know to be right. But this thing that you sometimes don't know what's going to happen because you haven't done it yet, based on the information that's locally available, universe doesn't know what to do yet. Right? I think that what free will here means is a form of what Stephen Wolfram calls computational irreducibility. It means that sometimes you cannot predict what the universe is going to do without running the universe actually to that point. There is no shortcut. Right? So it's basically the fact that the universe is an evolving thing that has this boundary in time where stuff has, in order to causally influence it, all these causal factors have to become available. And so for you to be able to make that decision, you need to have information that is not available before that point, right? So some of the decisions you can only really make at this point, or you couldn't make it because you didn't have the time, the computational resources to do it before that point. And so before you're able to gather the information and deploy the resources that you need to make the decision, you cannot make it. And so in some sense, this is also going to stay the case for AI. That means that AI is not able to predict things that has not been computed yet without actually computing it. But the decisions that human beings are making, unaugmented with AI, are relatively simple for the most part, right? So I suspect AIs can outmodel unaugmented humans soon. In a sense, in the same way as we can usually outmodel children. So if you have a small child and you are an experienced kindergarten teacher, you probably know what this kid is going to be up to next before this kid knows it. And so a similar thing could happen in many cases with the AI, because our degree of freedom is too low for the AI not to be obvious. But of course, if you augment people, then this is going to turn into an arms race that makes this whole game much more interesting again. Anyway, I think this was in... Oh.
Yeah, I just want to add, I agree with what you said. I think personally I gave a concept for free will. It's like a wrapper for cause and effect and nothing else. Free will is just a representation, like you said. But for me, it's personally just like cause and effect. It's just going through. So AI is much better to make those decisions rather than us calling free will is a really unique thing. So I really like what you just said.
Okay, thank you everyone. I think this was an amazing discussion. As long as the organizers don't kick us out, please feel free to hang and chat with each other. And thank you, Lou, for helping me with this. And thank you very much again to the organizers. And Marcus for this wonderful introduction into the discussion, which was very helpful. Awesome. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks. Awesome.
May I introduce myself to you?
Please.
My name